For more than 70 years, a single document remained locked away, buried not in some forgotten archive, but hidden deliberately, sealed by those who feared what it contained. Not because it was nonsense, and not because it threatened power in any obvious way, but because it struck a chord so precise, so intimate, that it risked unraveling the illusion we all quietly agreed to live under. The man behind it was Edgar Cayce, often called the Sleeping Prophet, and while most remember him for his predictions about Earth changes or Atlantis, few know that his most dangerous revelation had nothing to do with the physical world at all. It was about souls, where they come from, why do they forget, and what happens when entire civilizations fall asleep inside their own spiritual amnesia. This isn't a story about mysticism. It's a story about what happens when truth becomes too heavy for the collective mind to carry. So it gets buried, sealed, and erased, until now. To understand why this document was hidden for so long, you first have to understand who Edgar Cayce really was. Not the myth, not the folklore, but the man at the center of one of the strangest and most thoroughly documented phenomena in American history. Born in 1877 in rural Kentucky, Cayce was not a preacher, a mystic, or a self-proclaimed prophet. He was a photographer, a quiet man, a devout Christian who often struggled to reconcile what was happening to him with what he had been taught in church. He didn't seek out visions. He fell into them, accidentally at first, then with increasing precision, as if something on the other side had chosen him as a conduit. By the time of his death in 1945, he had conducted more than 14,000 recorded trance readings, most of which were stenographed, archived, and stored. Doctors, scientists, even members of Congress came to him for insight. And while much attention was given to his predictions about geopolitical shifts, climate upheaval, and the return of Atlantis, it was his recurring statements about the soul, its origin, its journey, and its ultimate forgetting, that made those around him increasingly uncomfortable. Because Cayce didn't just describe a spiritual reality, he insisted it was more real than anything we experience with the five senses. And worse, he claimed that humanity was already deep into a crisis not of war, but of identity. A forgetting so complete that even mentioning it would sound absurd to those most affected. In 1932, during a private session that was never meant to be public, Cayce spoke of a coming collapse, not of governments, but of meaning itself. He described a period when people would become soullessly busy, driven not by higher purpose, but by distraction, self-preservation, and spiritual exhaustion. He warned of a time when the soul's true origin would be so deeply buried beneath cultural noise and false narratives that even those who sensed something was wrong would have no language for it. That reading, and a series of others connected to it, were removed from circulation by the foundation managing his work. Officially, they were too speculative. Unofficially, they struck too close to something sacred, something the modern world was not ready to confront. One sealed envelope was placed in a restricted archive with instructions not to open it for 70 years. No public announcement. No acknowledgement, just quiet removal. That envelope was finally unsealed in 2001, and what was inside wasn't a prediction of future disasters. It was a map of the soul's descent, of the stages through which human beings slowly forget what they are, and of the strange, silent systems that feed on that forgetting. Cayce wasn't warning about the end of the world. He was describing the machinery behind why civilizations collapse from the inside out. when the soul can no longer remember it was ever awake. And that was just the beginning. Most people think of forgetting as something accidental, something that happens slowly over time, like erosion. But Cayce described it differently. To him, forgetting wasn't passive. It was structured. It followed a pattern. And, worst of all, it was predictable. According to one of his most suppressed readings, the soul's disconnection from its divine origin follows a 7-stage descent. Not random, not chaotic, a precise rhythm, one that echoes through both individual lives and entire civilizations. And once the rhythm begins, it almost never stops. It accelerates silently beneath the surface of ordinary life. Cayce claimed that the soul doesn't simply forget who it is trained to forget. Conditioned by environment, education, and emotion until the memory of why you came here is no longer just hidden. It becomes irrelevant. The first stage begins with distraction, a subtle pull away from inward stillness toward external noise. It doesn't feel like a fall. It feels like engagement, busy schedules, constant input, endless minor decisions. But this is the beginning of the descent, because a distracted soul cannot hear itself. The second stage is identification. You begin to define yourself by roles, titles, affiliations, forgetting that these are costumes worn by spirit, not the spirit itself. You become the job, the status, the personality. You no longer ask why you're here, only how well you're performing at the thing you've mistaken for your identity. By the third stage, dissonance, the soul begins to sense something is off. There are flashes of discomfort, a quiet dissatisfaction that can't be solved by achievement or comfort. Most people don't realize this is the soul trying to surface. Instead, they double down. They buy more, consume more, distract more. The voice gets quieter. Then comes numbness, not pain, absence. You don't feel disconnected. You feel indifferent. You're functioning, but something has hollowed. Joy becomes memory. Inspiration becomes rare. You begin to confuse emotional fatigue with maturity, and spiritual collapse with growing up. The fifth stage is inversion. Values flip. What once seemed meaningful now seems naive. Stillness becomes laziness. Sincerity becomes weakness. The soul doesn't just forget its origin, it begins to resent it. The memory of higher truth becomes uncomfortable, like a mirror that no longer flatters. By the sixth stage, externalization, you begin projecting the inner vacuum onto the outer world. Blame replaces reflection. Everyone else becomes the problem, the system, the other side, the past, the future. At this point, the soul has not only forgotten its origin, it actively avoids anything that might remind it. And finally comes collapse. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a slow, invisible leak of vitality that spreads across an entire people until they are spiritually vacant. They function, they build, they innovate. But the animating force is gone. The civilization may continue for generations, but it is already over. What Cayce described was not just the journey of a lost individual, it was the template for civilizational entropy. Ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome. He believed they all followed this pattern. Rapid ascent, subtle forgetting, spiritual drift, and then the slow fall, long before the outer structures crumbled. And now, Cayce warned, we are in the fifth stage, inversion, where truth feels dangerous and illusion feels safe, where people scroll past wisdom because it's too still, too real, too quiet. This pattern was never made public. In fact, the document that outlines it, reading 3973-13, was removed from circulation in 1933, less than a year after it was given. An appendix to that reading, never officially released, includes a single underlined phrase written in the archivist's hand: the rhythm of collapse. That phrase is circled in red ink, no other notes, no explanation, no commentary. Just that rhythm, preserved and ignored, like a pulse the world didn't want to hear. But here's what makes this more than just an old prophecy. The stages weren't meant to terrify. They were meant to identify. Because once you see the descent, you can interrupt it. If you feel numbness creeping in, if your values have begun to shift in ways you can't explain, if your inner voice sounds more distant than ever before, it may not be a personal failing. It may be that you've been caught in a descent older than history, a current so quiet, so persistent, that entire societies have followed it into the dark, thinking all the while that they were waking up. So now ask yourself, how far into the pattern have you already gone? And, more importantly, can you still feel the difference between who you are and what the world trained you to become? But that's only half the story. Because once the soul forgets, once enough individuals pass through the 7 stages of spiritual amnesia, something else begins to move. Cayce never gave it a name, not directly. He spoke of it in metaphors, fragments, guarded phrasing, as if simply describing it too clearly would give it more power. What he suggested, though, is unmistakable. The descent doesn't just happen in isolation. It doesn't end with personal numbness. According to a hidden series of readings between 1933 and 1937, none of which were made public during his lifetime, Cayce spoke of a mechanism that activates when human beings stop vibrating in alignment with their origin. Not a machine in the conventional sense, not something built or programmed, but something alive, responsive, designed not to punish, but to sustain itself. He called it the resonance that feeds, not on electricity, not even on emotion, but on disconnection itself. And what he described sounds disturbingly like a kind of interdimensional feedback loop, an invisible system that harvests the ambient frequency of spiritual exhaustion. Not suffering in its rawest form, but the specific vibration created when a soul loses its inner compass and stops seeking truth altogether. In this state, the human mind doesn't question. The heart doesn't open. The soul doesn't resist. It floats, dull, passive, and compliant. And in that passivity, it begins to emit something Cayce described as a hollowed current, a resonance that certain unseen intelligences recognize and consume. Let that settle for a moment. Because if what Cayce hinted at is true, then the exhaustion you feel when you're doing everything right, working, contributing, surviving, might not be a flaw in the system. It might be the point. The loop isn't random. It's fed by repetition. Cycles of distraction, microdopamine hits, surface-level thinking. The more predictable the human, the stronger the signal. That's why modern life feels more efficient but less alive. We've made productivity a god and silence an enemy. And in that silence, that stillness Cayce begged people to return to, lies the only thing that can break the loop. According to a redacted segment from a 1935 session, Cayce referred to those who sit above the loop. Intelligences he described as not hostile, but dependent. They do not invade. They do not conquer. They wait. They harvest. And they only become strong when you become spiritually stillborn. Most people never even notice the pattern, but you can feel it. You can feel it when you wake up tired, not from lack of rest, but from something deeper you can't name. You feel it when moments of joy are interrupted by phantom guilt. You feel it when you scroll endlessly, not because you're interested, but because the stillness underneath is unbearable. And perhaps the most disturbing part, it's scalable. Cayce believed that entire cultures could be caught in this loop, transmitting that same hollow current across entire networks of human behavior, until the planet itself begins to hum with dissonance. No external invasion necessary. The farm builds itself. This was never stated plainly, but it was implied across dozens of buried notes. In a 1936 draft reading addressed privately to a former student of theosophy, Cayce reportedly used the phrase, "The mind becomes livestock when it no longer sings." That reading was never published. Its page was torn in half and filed separately, until it resurfaced in a private archive in 1999. You weren't meant to hear this, because if enough people realize that their despair is being harvested, not healed, if they understand that their daily weariness is not merely biochemical, but a spiritual byproduct of forgetting, then the loop breaks. The current collapses. The resonance falls silent, and something else begins to return. But first, you have to ask the question that has no comfortable answer. What if your daily exhaustion wasn't accidental? What if the noise, the conflict, the overstimulation, it's all part of the system that keeps you tired enough to stop asking questions? And deeper still, if your pain feeds something, what happens when you choose not to suffer unconsciously anymore? This isn't a call to rebellion, it's a call to presence. Because Cayce made one final claim, buried in a handwritten note found inside the sleeve of an unrelated reading. It simply said, "When the soul stops vibrating in pain, they cannot hear it anymore." Who are they? We're not ready to answer that, not yet. But the loop is real. The system is active. And the question remains, are you feeding it or breaking it? So what happens when the soul begins to stir? After lifetimes adrift in spiritual anesthesia, something shifts. Not suddenly, but undeniably. A sensation starts to build, quiet but relentless. A hunger for meaning, a pulse of stillness behind the noise, a recognition, however faint, that something about the world feels off. This is supposed to be the turning point, the moment of return, the beginning of liberation. But what Cayce suggested, carefully and only in the margins of his most obscure readings, is that this is where the real danger begins. Because the moment you begin to awaken, something else begins to wait. It doesn't resist you. It welcomes you. It applauds your growth, echoes your insights, flatters your pain. It offers you light, abundant, radiant, seductive. But the light isn't what it seems. It's not darkness pretending to be light. It's something far more precise. It's structure, system, architecture, a spiritual feedback loop designed not to block your awakening, but to redirect it, to harvest it. Cayce pointed to a stage beyond forgetting, the illusion of remembrance, a phase where the soul begins to sense the loop, begins to break from the hypnosis, only to walk into another layer, one with better music, sharper symbols, glowing language, but still a loop. These systems don't ask for your denial. They offer you vocabulary, teachers, truth. They give you the appearance of elevation, the feeling of arrival. They teach presence but center performance. They reward emotional catharsis while quietly demanding dependency. And this is the brilliance of the trap. It feels like awakening. The seeker leaves behind the obvious noise of materialism and enters a new domain. Rituals, healing, higher frequencies. But still, the power is outside. Still, the path requires permission. Still, the compass is external. There is no forced compliance here, only encouragement, admiration, fluorescent reverence for all the right ideas, detached entirely from the inner fire they were meant to invoke. People who once longed for silence now attend workshops that speak of stillness, but never stop speaking. People who once felt pain become fluent in the language of healing, but never leave the loop of healing itself. And somewhere deep beneath all of it, the soul whispers, "This isn't it." A note buried in Cayce's 1935 materials, a phrase marked with urgency but left unexplained, hints at the depth of this distortion. It simply stated that many would awaken, only to follow the wrong sun. The implications are not symbolic. In countless modern accounts, particularly from near-death experiencers and trauma survivors, there are reports of encounters with entities that radiate light, warmth, and acceptance, but lack depth. Beings whose eyes do not blink, whose voices soothe, but whose presence erases. It's not that these experiences are fake. It's that they're partial, engineered, designed to hold you just far enough from truth to keep you seeking, forever consuming light, never becoming it. And that's where this trap becomes so devastating. Because it doesn't numb the soul, it uses it. It takes your longing and feeds off of it, converts the energy of awakening into a closed circuit. You feel alive, inspired, even transformed, but you're still tethered, still orbiting something that reflects your light back to you without ever allowing you to stand in it fully. This is how spiritual systems become harvesting machines, not by suppressing you, but by satisfying you just enough to stop you from leaving. The most dangerous forms of manipulation aren't those that threaten you. They're the ones that praise you. They mimic growth. They echo your words back to you. They tell you you're home, just before locking the gate behind you. That's why most people who begin to awaken end up more exhausted than before. They feel clarity for a moment, then confusion, joy, then numbness, breakthrough, then burnout. They've left the matrix of materialism, but entered the matrix of false light. And they rarely notice it, because the trap feels like healing. So now you have to ask, is your awakening rooted in stillness or performance? Are you expanding into presence or accumulating new labels? Are you moving toward freedom or circling a brighter cage? Not all teachers are false, but the most dangerous ones never argue with you. They agree. They reflect. They show you exactly what you want to see. So you stop looking. Real awakening doesn't flatter you. It burns. It strips. It leaves you disoriented and quiet before it leaves you whole. That's what these systems of false light never require. They offer transcendence without descent. Ego comfort wrapped in cosmic vocabulary. A shortcut that never brings you home. But your soul knows. And if, even in your most elevated moments, you felt something just slightly off, an unease, a hollowness, a sense that something essential is missing. It may not be a doubt. It may be a memory, a quiet reminder that the light you're chasing isn't the one that warms your soul. And if that's true, if the false sun really does rise every day, then maybe the final test isn't whether you awaken. It's whether you remember what it felt like before you forgot. By now, the pattern should feel familiar. Not because you've seen it with your eyes, but because you've felt it in your life. The drift, the disconnection, the illusion of awakening followed by another trap. But what Cayce revealed next was the most difficult truth of all. Not because it was hidden, but because it was uncomfortably simple. Collapse doesn't come from outside. It's not forced on us by some cosmic enemy or divine punishment. It's chosen, slowly, quietly, repeatedly, by each of us. Cayce's most unsettling claim wasn't about Atlantis, prophecy, or lost technologies. It was about compliance. The idea that over time, soul by soul, we opt into our own unraveling. Not through violence or rebellion, but through apathy, through comfort, through a long series of compromises that feel reasonable, until you realize they've replaced your ability to feel anything at all. He described civilizations, not just ours, but many before us, that fell the same way. Not with a war, not with a bang, but with a sigh. People didn't resist the collapse. They agreed to it, piece by piece. They gave up stillness for speed, intuition for data, mystery for control, purpose for productivity, and eventually, soul for comfort. Not because they were evil, but because the noise was easier to live with than the silence that might have led them home. Cayce framed collapse not as divine wrath, but as a reset mechanism, an intelligent event triggered only when the collective soul body of a civilization ignores its internal compass for too long. He said that when too many people stop listening to themselves, the system reboots. And not gently. This was not meant to scare. It was meant to awaken. Because if the collapse is chosen, that means something else is true too. It can be unchosen. Not by fighting institutions or rejecting the material world, but by refusing, in your own life, to keep feeding the systems that numb you. Cayce never preached against technology or wealth or science. What he warned against was disembodiment, the soul becoming so hypnotized by outer distractions that it forgets the inner frequency it once knew. That forgetting isn't neutral. It emits a signature, a pulse. And over time, that pulse shapes the world. You see it in the rise of simulation over sensation, in the worship of optimization over intuition, in the way we seek convenience even if it costs us our presence. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It seduces. It offers efficiency, entertainment, dopamine. It replaces real awakening with trends and templates, and it convinces you that the ache inside is personal, when it's actually a sign that the structure itself is starving your soul. In a restricted 1942 entry found only in handwritten form, Cayce spoke of the last veil, a stage of descent where people still speak of truth, still wear the language of love, but no longer feel it, because the signal has dimmed so low that even the words have lost their weight. He said once that threshold is crossed, the outer structures begin to mirror the internal collapse. Politics, culture, nature itself. Not as punishment, but as a feedback loop, a mirror, not broken, just honest. And if you're still watching this, you've probably felt it already. The uncanny sense that something is off, not wrong, not evil, just misaligned. A life that looks fine from the outside but leaves you fragmented on the inside. You've noticed how silence has become rare, how people speak without meaning, how the world moves fast but arrives nowhere. That's not decay. That's the echo of a million tiny choices made in forgetfulness. And the collapse? That's just the echo getting louder. So you need to ask yourself, what if your desire for comfort is the very thing that keeps you asleep? What if the systems that ease your pain are the same ones that ensure you never fully wake up? Because here's the truth buried beneath Cayce's warning. You are not powerless. The systems that harvest your energy, that loop your attention, that dilute your soul, they can't function without your permission. Even passive permission. Even tired consent. And when you stop giving it, when you remember the sound of your own inner voice, the loop breaks. Not globally, but personally. And that's where it starts. Collapse isn't coming. It's been happening. And the only real question left is this: are you choosing it or not choosing it? The collapse Edgar Cayce warned about was never meant to look dramatic. It didn't arrive with fire, floods, or a single moment of mass destruction. It didn't scream. It whispered, quietly, persistently, across generations. And that's what made it almost impossible to detect. Not because the signs weren't there, but because they looked so normal. A culture that forgets how to pray but remembers how to perform. Children are raised to memorize data, but never to trust their own intuition. Workplaces filled with people who no longer ask why, only how fast. The collapse Cayce saw wasn't a singular crisis. It was a condition, a soul-wide erosion. And once you understand that, the document hidden away for 70 years begins to feel different. It doesn't read like prophecy, not in the way most expect. It doesn't predict what's coming. It describes what already happened. A metaphysical biopsy of a species in free fall, disconnected not just from each other, but from the source that animated them. It outlines how forgetting becomes tradition, how numbness becomes identity, how distraction is no longer a coping mechanism, but a worldview. And the scariest part? You feel it in yourself. In the moments you catch yourself scrolling through life, but never feeling it. In the sense that something is missing, but the world tells you everything's fine. In the quiet fear that you've inherited a story that doesn't know your name. That document doesn't describe a future to prepare for. It exposes a present we've been trained not to notice. And Cayce's real message wasn't about survival, it was about memory. Because forgetting isn't random, it's structured, it's engineered. Modern life isn't just busy, it's ritualized amnesia. 1,000 tiny choices every day that take you further from the part of you that remembers what you are. Not a worker, not a brand, not a problem to solve, but a signal. A fragment of a greater intelligence trying to come back online. And the final reflection Cayce left behind may be the most uncomfortable one. What if forgetting your spiritual origin wasn't a side effect of modern life, but the purpose behind it? If that's true, then the systems around you aren't failing. They're succeeding at keeping you asleep. But something is waking up. And now that you've heard this, you'll never be able to unhear it.